Variable rate debt, which for anybody who has a mortgage or has been following the mortgage and foreclosure crisis, a variable rate debt is like an adjustable rate mortgage, where it's cheaper for the borrower because the interest rates might fluctuate. And so what you as a borrower are doing is kind of assuming some of the risk that interest rates might go high. And because you're assuming some of the risk, the lender is going to let you have that debt slightly more cheaply. In other words, at a lower interest rate is the idea. And the banks came enough, I'm sorry, one more thing. The problem with that for a government is that governments really need predictability, like above all. You know, we can see the T just kind of like, you know, walked into fiscal year 13 with a $161 million deficit and imposed this like ridiculous scenarios on us. Clearly, if they had any kind of like long-term planning, this wouldn't be happening. And so they need long-term planning. So they don't like this variable rate thing because they can't budget for it. So what they accepted from the banks was a gamble. The banks said, all right, we'll give you a variable rate payment that will roughly match the variable rate payment you're making on your bonds. And this can all be part of the discussion. I can elaborate on all this if you have questions. And in return, you give us a fixed rate. So theoretically, the variable rate that the banks are paying the T cancels out the variable rate that the T is paying to its bondholders. And the net cost to the T is that fixed rate that's going out back to the banks. So that's the interest rate swap, and that's the graphic at the bottom, and it's really no more complicated than that. The MBTA swaps a fixed rate for a variable rate. So what's the problem? So when Lehman Brothers bid it in September 2008, and all the other banks threatened to follow right after that, the Fed came to the rescue. And they needed to make it much cheaper for banks to borrow, so they could theoretically loan money and get the economy going again. Clearly that didn't work, but that was the thinking at the time, theoretically. So what they did was they lowered interest rates to near 0%. And they made it essentially free for banks to borrow from one another. That 0% is what drives the variable rate that the T is getting from the bank. The problem is that the T signed these swap contracts locked in at rates between 3 and 5.6%. So the bottom line is that on the average deal, as of last week, when I ran the numbers, banks are paying the T about 0.2%, and the T is paying banks about 4.47%. So on net, 4.27% is the interest that the T is paying the banks. And like no one's paying 4.27% now. Like anybody has a savings account, like you probably have not checked it online for a couple of years because it doesn't make a difference. So that's the bottom line, that's the graphic. What this means in terms of numbers, like when you apply these percentages to actual dollars, what it means is that the T is losing about $26 million a year on these deals. And it's like right at 26 million. So when I say over, it should really be about, because like some days it's just below. But it's about $26 million. These are long-term contracts that are generally tied to like the length of the debt. This is long-term debt we're talking about. So through 2031, the T is on the hook, excuse me, for $287 million in payments. And here's the real kicker. The T, right, so like they're locked into these high fixed rates. So what many of you are maybe wondering is like, well, why don't they just renegotiate those high fixed rates? That's what a home borrower would do. So they can't, because they have to pay these things called termination penalties, which are part of the contracts. And right now, the termination penalty would be $103 million to get out of these swaps. So the T has a deficit of $161 million. It's losing $26 million a year in these swaps. And in order to get out of these swaps, it would have to pay 4 times what it's losing. So you can't win. I mean, it's a king's ransom. So like, let's think about what $26 million means in terms of the proposed cuts and savings. So if the T cuts these services and raises its fares, for these particular service categories, this is what the kind of net benefit, quote unquote, will be to the T. So everything highlighted in red is a number below $26 million. In other words, if these things were to go away tomorrow, the T could theoretically say, okay, we're not going to do the bus fare increase in either scenario 1 or scenario 2. We're not going to raise fares on riders with disabilities. We're not going to like any of this stuff. They wouldn't have to do it if the swaps weren't weighing them down. So which banks are we talking about? There are 3 banks. The T has swaps with 4 banks, but it's actually making a little bit of money on one of them, on swaps with one of the banks. So like theoretically, if the demand came out that the T should renegotiate its swaps, we wouldn't want to focus on the one that is actually making money. But the 3 in which it's losing are UBS, JP Morgan Chase, and Deutsche Bank. So just a little something about these banks and the deals. The MBTA is losing about $9 million a year to UBS. It's on the hook for another almost $100 million. And the termination penalties, the ransom is $39 million. The CEO made $3 million in 2010, which is actually nothing for these 3 banks. They got a $77 billion taxpayer bailout. They're a Swiss bank, and they got a $77 billion taxpayer bailout. And These were ones that the Fed tried to keep secret for a very long time, but Bloomberg just FOIA'd the hell out of them and finally got the information out, which is good for researchers like me. The JP Morgan Chase, about $9 million a year again, on the hook for another $115 million over the course of the swaps, and the termination penalties are $40 million. Its CEO made $20.8 million in 2010. And he's been like way out in front on beating back bank regulation. He's been incredibly vocal about it. His name's Jamie Dimon. They got a $100 billion taxpayer bailout. And they're also foreclosing on homes all over Boston. JP Morgan Chase is one of the leading mortgage lenders and also one of the leading foreclosing banks. I didn't bring it here because Somerville hasn't had quite the foreclosure crisis that other neighborhoods in greater Boston have. It hasn't gotten away scot-free by no means. But I was at City Life Vita Urbana last night, which is a bank tenant organization in Boston whose homeowners largely come from Dorchester, Roxbury, JP, Mattapan, and Hyde Park. And I had a map that showed all the JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank foreclosures in that neighborhood, in those neighborhoods, along with the bus cuts. And it's just devastating. Like, I mean, they're getting killed twice by the same banks. And then Deutsche Bank, $8 million a year is what the T is losing, $75 million over the course, and $23 million to get out of the deals. And you don't need to take like detailed notes. I can send this around afterwards. And the CEO made about $8 million in 2010. They got a $66 billion US taxpayer bailout. They're a German bank. And they're also foreclosing banks. They don't loan, they don't do home mortgages, but they service loans. And that's what puts them in the role of being like one of the leading foreclosing banks around here. So I've been avoiding the word solution because the deficit's $161 million, and if you go in there and say, I've got $26 million for you, like someone's going to be like, well, where's the other $135 million? So no one's calling it a solution, and I would suggest that we not, but certainly a concrete step. So like I said, the long-term structural solution lies with the legislature. You know, right now there's a bill that's not going to be looked at this year, but in the next fiscal year it'll be looked at. It's called an Act to Invest in Our Communities. And it's progressive taxation through the back door. This is somewhat of a digression, but anybody who doesn't know, in Massachusetts, if you want to do progressive taxation, in other words, taxing higher earners at higher rates, you need to change the state constitution, which means you need to convene a constitutional convention, which ain't going to happen anytime soon. So what you can do legislatively is to raise the rate that everyone pays, and then also raise the exemption up to like $100,000 so that the middle class doesn't take a hit. And it effectively ends up being a tax on higher earners. That would net the state about $1.5 billion and could really like help facilitate the conversation about priorities that right now like we just can't realistically have, because our speaker Robert DeLeo has already said no new taxes, no new revenues, like just right out of the gate, ruling it off the menu of options. Well, the nice thing about the swaps is that it's not really up to the legislature. The MBTA's board can go to the banks and demand, ask, call on, phrase it however you like, but they can begin the conversation independently. Like, these are contracts the MBTA signed with the banks, and they can go to the banks and say, listen, remember those bailouts that we gave you? Well, now it's your turn to step up and do your part. But the MBTA board won't do it unless they hear from us. And I didn't want to put this in the PowerPoint, but I should add an asterisk to this. I can tell you from experience, they won't do it if they hear from me. I and a couple colleagues of mine met with the general manager of the MBTA last week, along with the chief financial officer of the Mass Department of Transportation. And I had a fact sheet, and we had sent the fact sheet to Secretary of Transportation Richard Davey ahead of time. He was very excited about the idea. He said, please meet with my general manager and my finance person and have a good conversation. And like I was halfway through my first sentence and they were just down my throat, and the conversation just like went downhill from there. Like, they are not interested. And I have my theories as to why they're not interested, and I can elaborate on those. That's not insider information. So the MBTA, especially after that meeting, is now a target. I mean, they were always going to be an informational target, but now they might be a target for real action. So, as everyone knows, they're holding public hearings on the proposals. You guys did phenomenal work and got great coverage at last week's public hearing. They had the one in Lynn. Right now, there are 2 going on tonight. There were 2 last night, and there's another one going on in Brighton. There have been 2 held in Speaker DeLeo's district, which I think is pretty awesome. So the next official board meetings, like the next time that the MBTA board is actually going to kind of come out of their boroughs, is March 14th. Originally, March 14th was going to be the last date, or probably it was going to be the last date at which they were going to kind of like, take all the public input, assemble it into some big information package, and then make their decision based on that. So they decided last week that like given that they've got to balance the budget by April 15th, and given that there's one more board meeting, it would be a bad idea to foreclose on like more discussion now. So they decided to put off that day of reckoning until April 4th.